this time we're going to talk about our next model, so our third model that we'll be learning about, which is the ASAD curve. So let's move through this one and see how it goes. So we're going to learn about what is this model, why we use this model, and then the different parts of this model. So this will definitely come up in the exam, so it's really important that you understand what this model shows and how to make changes on it. So firstly, we'll look at what does it show us. So the ASAD model is a macroeconomic model that explains the relationship between price level and output. So firstly, AS, that means aggregate supply, and AD means aggregate demand. So you might remember back in level 1 that we did demand and supply curves. Alright, so the reason why it's AD and AS now is because aggregate means the whole market, not just, for example, the market for cats. So in level 1 we look at one particular market. It might be somebody's particular, like Miss Fraser's demand for yoga, whatever it might be, alright? So now we actually take a step back and we look at the whole market as a whole, and the word we use in economics is aggregate. Okay, so it's the whole economy. So when we look at our circular flow model, that's our whole economy. Those are all the different sectors in it. So that's just some lingo for you. And the reason why we use it is it actually shows us lots of different relationships between, so there's 3 main macroeconomic goals: unemployment and inflation. So this model can actually show us changes in all of those things. It shows us growth, it can show us how that's affecting unemployment, and it can show us inflation, because inflation is measured by the price level. So in this topic though, you'll only be looking at growth. So the movements of the 2 curves can be used to predict the effects that various events will have on those 2 variables, either real GDP or the price level. So we'll learn about real GDP more, probably next actually, we'll learn it next. This is how we measure if real GDP is going up or down. We use that x-axis. And then we also use the price level. So price level and real GDP are always going to be on those axes. And you'll always have those 2 curves. AS will always look like that, and AD will always look like that. And you'll always have 2 curves intersecting. That middle point where they connect is the equilibrium. Okay, so that's where PL is equal to Y. Y is output. So the different components we've just talked about, you've got the aggregate demand curve, downward sloping, it's always going that way. Remember, don't get these mixed up. So your AD curve will always go down that way, law of demand, remember from last year. And then the aggregate supply curve will always go up like that for the law of supply as well. So you might need to refresh your memory if you didn't remember those 2. But just remember that they always do go that way around. And then as we talked, on the y-axis we have the price level, on the x-axis we have the real GDP, and y is a symbol that we use for output. So it's sort of like quantity. So if we're looking just at the aggregate demand curve right now, in the exam, the end goal is to determine what curve moves and why. So you'll need to create a shift. So here's an example of just the AD curve, shifting to the right. So the total real output purchased at each price level represents the total demand in the economy. So if we just look at that graph for a second, if the price level stays the same, we can see that our output is going to increase. We've moved further along that x-axis, okay? The things that move or create changes on aggregate demand is either consumer spending, government spending, investment spending, or net exports, which is exports minus imports. So we've seen those symbols before on the circular flow model. So that's why those symbols were so important back on our circular flow model, because it shows you the money flows, and then those are the money flows that shift aggregate demand. So you need to memorize this equation, and you need to know what each of them are. So if we go back to our circular flow model, you can see here that C is up the top, consumption spending. So that is the flow that moves from the households to producers or companies. So you need to be able to explain that. I is investment that moves from financial sector to companies. So you'll need to explain that as well. G is government spending, so that moves from government to producers. And then X minus M, so export receipts is over by the overseas sector. And then import payments, remember that's money leaving our country to go overseas. So any of those factors shift the AD curve. Alright, so it's really important that you know those. In the exam, you'll be given a scenario, and the scenario will be one of those factors, or it might be a couple of those factors in the equation. So it might talk about could talk about, I don't know, increased demand. So that would relate to C of consumer spending. It could talk about incomes, and then you know that that relates to consumer spending as well. It could also relate, if incomes increase, then more investment could also happen. So then you'll talk about C and I. And then you would shift the curve outward if we go back. So you would shift the curve to the right because it's increasing. So the factors that influence the AD curve: consumption increases, so then that's a shift to the right. If consumption decreases, that will be a shift to the left. If investment increases, we would shift to the right. If investment decreases, we would shift to the left. If government spending increases, shift to the right. Government spending decreases, shift to the left. Same with net exports. Increases to the right, decreases to the left. Alright, so really important that we get the left and the rights correct as well. Increase and decrease, and then you just explain why. So why has that occurred? If we look at aggregate supply now, the factors that influence aggregate supply are cost of production, cost of imports, productivity, and tax. So if there was, for example, a rise in the cost of imported raw materials, that means it costs the company more to produce that good. So their supply is going to decrease. So that would be a shift to the left. If there was a decrease in productivity, so the workers, hurt themselves, or they didn't have the right skills to get the job done, the productivity is going to decrease. So their supply, their total output would also decrease. So that would be a shift to the left. If there was a rise in wages, that means the company is paying out more. So their costs are going to go up. So their production is going to decrease. So that would be a shift to the left. So just how I'm talking about the flow on between each factor, that's what you need to write about. So if there was a rise in GST, that means that the company is paying more in indirect taxes, therefore their supply would go down, their production would go down, therefore their supply would shift to the left. Same with a price in oil, that's going to increase their prices, so their whole output would decrease, therefore creating a shift to the left. And then if we look at supply increasing, so supply would increase when there was a decrease in the cost of imported raw materials. So let's say we were making shoes and then we imported all the materials from overseas and then put them together. And let's say all the leather and the heels and the straps and the buckles, maybe those prices decreased. So now it's cheaper for me to make those shoes. So I'm going to increase my supply. Therefore, my output would increase, and therefore the curve shifts to the right. If there was an increase in productivity, maybe I got super speedy at creating them, or all my workers, maybe they got new technology and that increased their output. That's going to create an increase in supply, therefore shift to the right. If there was a decrease in the price of oil, this is a bit of a tricky one, but if the price of oil drops, that usually means that the whole production line is more affordable. Okay, so you think of cars and transport and trucks. So we use oil to get around. This is happening as well right at this point in time. The oil prices dropped very, very low, negative at the moment. So that's going to increase supply because it's cheaper for the company to produce their goods and services. All right, so you need to learn these factors are associated only with the supply curve. So you will get a scenario and you need to decide, are these factors going to increase or decrease supply? And just as a reminder, where the two curves intersect, we call that equilibrium. And this is just summarizing that this model is powerful because we have the price level, it shows us the output or real GDP. The YF line we use for full employment. Probably you don't need to worry about that right now. Same with the income. So this was just a reminder slide about equilibrium and the different components. So just to summarize how this type of question would work in the exam, you'd be given a scenario. For example, let's say that on average the GDP growth rose by 3% from last year up to this year because of domestic demand. Okay, so that would be the scenario. Your first thing to do is to think about, is it related to the AD curve? Is it one of those factors there? Or is it related to the AS curve, and is it one of those factors? So if we think about domestic demand, that would relate to consumer spending, which is the C in the equation, in the AD equation. So now we know, okay, domestic demand is going to increase. So therefore the AD curve would increase, and that would be a shift to the right. You would then talk about why you made those changes on the graph and include all your graph coordinates and then expand on the impact. Is it positive economic growth or is it negative economic growth? So in this case, you might say increasing domestic demand means that consumers will spend more, which is the C part of the equation. This will lead to increased incomes and employment, because if we think about the C part of households into producers and back in our circular flow model. So this will lead to increased incomes and employment, and firms may decide to invest more, which is I, as that demand for their products is going to increase. So therefore this will increase the aggregate demand curve, which will shift from AD to AD1. Alright, I'll leave it there. Any questions, let me know.